3 months had passed since the battle that broke the Kara swarm, and Velith Prime had become a world transformed by hope rather than fear. Yanara stood on the observation deck of the High Council building, watching human transport ships descend through the atmosphere with supplies and personnel. They had come as warriors, but they had stayed as something far more valuable to her wounded people engineers who helped rebuild the communication networks that the swarm had destroyed. Doctors who treated survivors of the attacks with medicines adapted for Velith biology. Teachers who shared knowledge freely with anyone who wished to learn. The human fleet had pushed the swarm back across 4 systems, hunting them with a relentless determination that had shattered their expansion completely. Reports from the frontier indicated that Karath forces were actively avoiding any territory where human ships had been detected. Word had spread through their hive mind communications. A warning passed from queen to queen across their vast network. Avoid the Deathworlders, the message said, for they are hunters that do not stop, and they fight for reasons we cannot understand. Yanara smiled at the thought of those monsters being afraid of the creatures that had consumed her people's colonies, now fleeing at the mere rumor of human presence. The door behind her opened and Commander Park entered, his massive frame somehow seeming less threatening than it had during their first meeting. Counselor, the High Council is ready to receive our delegation, he said with a formal bow that he had learned from Velith cultural briefings. I wanted to thank you personally before we begin, for trusting us when everything about our appearance must have terrified you. Yanara turned to face him with an expression that held warmth. She would never have thought possible 3 months ago. You came when we called. You bled for our people, and you asked nothing in return. She said quietly, It is we who should thank you, Commander. Though I am not sure we have words sufficient for the debt we owe. The council chamber was filled with representatives from across the Velith Concord, and Yanara noticed that none of them showed the fear that had dominated their first meeting with the humans. They had seen what Deathworlders could do when motivated by compassion rather than conquest, and that knowledge had changed everything. High Speaker Torvin rose to address the assembly with a voice that carried the hope of an entire species. We have gathered today to formalize our relationship with the United Earth Defense Coalition, he announced. They answered our desperate call for help and saved our civilization from extinction. And now we must decide how to honor that debt. He turned to Commander Park with an expression of profound gratitude on behalf of the Velith Concord. I offer humanity full membership in our alliance, with all the rights and privileges that status entails. The chamber fell silent as everyone waited for the human commander's response. And Yanara found herself holding her breath. Park stood slowly, his posture showing respect rather than the threat she had once seen in his every movement. High Speaker, we are honored by your offer and grateful for the trust it represents, he said in measured tones. But humanity is not ready for full integration into your civilization, as we are still learning how to be good neighbors to the galaxy. Surprised murmurs rippled through the assembly at his refusal, and Yanara saw confusion on the faces of counselors who had expected enthusiastic acceptance. However, Parr continued with a slight smile. We would like to propose an alternative arrangement that we believe serves both our peoples better. He activated a display that showed a map of Concord space with human patrol routes highlighted in blue. Humanity will serve as protectors for any species that cannot protect themselves, responding to threats like the swarm wherever they appear. His voice grew stronger as he outlined a vision that humans had developed during their time among the Velith. We ask for nothing in return except friendship and the chance to prove that Deathworlders can be forces for good in this galaxy. Yanara felt tears building in her eyes as she listened to his words, understanding finally why these terrifying creatures had answered her people's call. Why? High Speaker Torvin asked softly. echoing the question that had haunted Yanara since the day she first boarded the human flagship. Why would you bleed and die for strangers who can offer you nothing of comparable value in return? Commander Park was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of his entire species' history, because our ancestors learned through centuries of suffering that the strong have a responsibility to protect the weak, he said. We fought wars among ourselves that killed millions before we understood that lesson, and we swore that we would never forget it. He looked around the chamber at the Velith representatives who had once feared his kind above all else. You asked us for help because you could not save yourselves, and that was the only reason we needed. The alliance was formalized that day, a partnership between peaceful scholars and warrior protectors that would reshape the galaxy in years to come. Yanara found Myray in the gardens outside the council building, the human lieutenant sitting beneath a flowering tree with a peaceful expression on her face. You are leaving tomorrow, Yanara said as she approached, and she could not keep the sadness from her voice. The fleet is moving on to answer another distress call from a system we have never visited, Myray confirmed with a gentle smile. But I will return, Yanara, because Velith Prime has become a second home to me in these months we have spent together. Yanara reached into her robe and withdrew a small crystal pendant on a chain of woven metal, a traditional Velith bonding token. This is given to those we consider family, she explained as she pressed the gift into Murray's hands. Among my people, it represents a connection that transcends distance and time, a promise that we will always be part of each other's lives. Myray looked at the pendant with an expression that Yanara had learned to recognize as deep emotion. And then the human did something that startled her. Tears began to flow down Marie's cheeks, and she pulled Yanara into an embrace that was gentle, despite the strength behind it. Thank you, the lieutenant whispered, for seeing past what we look like and finding what we truly are. Yanara returned the embrace, no longer afraid of the Deathworlder who had become her dearest friend. Thank you for showing us that the most terrifying creatures in the galaxy can also be the kindest. The human fleet departed the next morning. 7 ships carrying 3,000 warriors who had become heroes to an entire civilization. But they left behind something more valuable than military protection. A change in how the galaxy understood the word Deathworlder. The ancient beacon's records were finally decoded in the weeks that followed, revealing the truth of its origins. It had been created by a species called the Morth, who had faced extinction millions of years ago until unknown warriors answered their call for help. The Morth had built the beacon as a gift to the future, a way to pass forward the salvation they had received to others who might one day need it. They had vanished from history long ago, but their legacy lived on in a simple message encoded at the heart of the device. When you are saved, become the savior. When you are protected, become the protector. For this is how kindness echoes through eternity. Yanara understood now that her people had become part of a chain stretching across millions of years. Links in a connection that bound the galaxy together through acts of compassion, and somewhere out in the darkness between stars, humanity continued that chain, answering calls for help from species they had never met because someone was afraid, and that was reason enough. The Velith whispered a new word for Deathworlder in their language now, a term that captured what they had learned from their unlikely saviors. They called them guardians, protectors, friends, and the word spread to other species who had heard stories of humans who fought for strangers in the end. Yanara thought as she watched the stars where her friends had disappeared. The most frightening thing about Deathworlders was not their strength or their violence. It was their capacity to love so fiercely that they would cross the galaxy and face any enemy just because someone had asked for help. And that, she decided, was the most beautiful kind of terrifying she could imagine. The dropship shook violently as it punched through the atmosphere, and Lieutenant Narration felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before every combat drop. Around her sat 30 soldiers of the 7th Rapid Assault Division. Their faces calm, despite the anti-aircraft fire that burst around them like deadly fireworks. They had done this before on training worlds and colony defense missions, but none of them had ever faced anything quite like the Karath swarm. 30 seconds to landing zone, the pilot announced over the internal speakers, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. Remember your training and watch your spacing. The bugs like to swarm from multiple directions, so keep your sectors covered. Mireille checked her rifle one final time, ensuring the ammunition counter showed full and the targeting system was properly calibrated. The soldier beside her, a massive man named Sergeant Do-Yoon Kang, caught her eye and nodded with the confidence of a veteran who had survived worse than alien monsters. First contact with a hostile species, he rumbled in his deep voice. And we get to be the ones who show them what humans are made of. Just remember, we are here to save the Velith, not to prove anything, Mireille replied. Though she could not deny the excitement that hummed through her blood, the dropship hit the ground hard enough to rattle teeth, and the rear ramp dropped to reveal a landscape that belonged in nightmares. The air was thick with spores and the smell of decay. And everywhere Mireille looked, she could see the organic structures that the swarm had built from the remains of the colony. But they had no time to take in the horror, because the Karath were already coming. A wave of chitinous bodies rushing toward the landing zone with terrifying speed. Contact front, someone shouted. And then the world dissolved into the thunder of weapons fire and the screech of dying aliens. Mireille moved on instinct, putting rounds into center mass of every creature that entered her field of fire. The Karath were fast and numerous, but human weapons had been designed to kill far more durable prey, and the aliens fell in waves before the defenders' line. A warrior broke through on her left and she spun to meet it, slamming the butt of her rifle into its head before putting 3 rounds through its thorax. Push forward. Commander Park's voice crackled over the communication network from his position with the main assault force. We need to reach the central hive before they can reinforce from the outlying areas. The humans advanced like a tide of controlled violence, moving in coordinated squads that covered each other with overlapping fields of fire. Mireille watched her fellow soldiers fight with the brutal efficiency that came from generations of warfare against predators, both animal and human. They did not panic when surrounded, did not break when wounded, did not hesitate when the enemy seemed endless. A Karath warrior managed to tackle Private Sung-Hoon Lee, pinning him to the ground with claws that sought his throat before anyone could react. Sung-Hoon drew his combat knife and buried it in the creature's eye, shoving the twitching corpse aside and rising with blood covering his face. I am fine, he reported calmly when Mireille moved to check on him, already reloading his weapon for the next engagement. Just need a shower when this is over. They fought through streets that had once held Velith families, past buildings that showed signs of desperate last stands by colonists who had been overwhelmed by the swarm. Mireille tried not to think too hard about what had happened to those civilians, focusing instead on the mission that might avenge them. The resistance grew fiercer as they approached the central hive, waves of warriors throwing themselves at the human lines with no regard for their own survival. They are protecting something, Sergeant Kang observed during a brief lull in the fighting, gesturing toward the massive organic structure that loomed ahead. The Queen must be inside, and she is calling every drone in range to stop us from reaching her. Commander Park's voice cut through the communication channel with orders that carried the weight of absolute authority. All units, prepare for final assault on the hive structure. We go in hard and we do not stop until the Queen is dead. The attack was a blur of violence and determination that Mireille would remember for the rest of her life. Humans poured into the hive through breaches they had blown in its walls, fighting in corridors made of organic material that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. The Karath came at them from every direction, dropping from ceilings and bursting through walls. And the humans met them with fire and blade and bare hands when necessary. Myre found herself separated from her squad in the chaos. Fighting back-to-back with soldiers she barely knew against enemies that seemed endless, a massive Karath warrior charged her, and she emptied her rifle into its chest. But still it came, claws reaching for her throat. She dropped the weapon and drew her sidearm, putting round after round into its head until it finally collapsed at her feet. "Lieutenant Yoon, we need support at Junction 7, someone called over the radio. And Myre ran toward the sound of battle without hesitation. She found a squad pinned down by a swarm of smaller drones, their ammunition running low and their position becoming desperate. "Covering fire!" she shouted, adding her weapon to theirs and creating enough of a break for the squad to fall back to better ground. The battle raged for hours that felt like days, and Myre lost track of how many times she came close to death. But the humans did not break, did not flee, did not stop pushing forward, no matter what the swarm threw at them. Finally, they reached the Queen's chamber, a vast space filled with the massive form of the creature that controlled the entire swarm. She was enormous, her body bloated with eggs, and her mind connected to every drone on the planet through bonds that humans could not fully understand. "You cannot win," a voice echoed through the chamber. And Myre realized with shock that the Queen was speaking through some form of telepathy. "We are eternal. We are hungry, and we will consume everything you try to protect." Commander Park stepped forward, his armor scarred and bloody from the fighting, but his posture showing no sign of fatigue. "You made a mistake when you attacked creatures under our protection," he said in a voice that carried absolute certainty. "We are what happens when a death world develops empathy, and we will never stop fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves." The Queen screamed as the assault teams opened fire, and the battle for the hive reached its terrible conclusion when it was over. When the Queen lay dead and the drones across the planet began to falter without her guidance, Myre stood among her fellow soldiers and felt the weight of what they had accomplished. 37 humans had died in the assault. Their bodies recovered and treated with the reverence that warriors deserved. Myre knew every one of their names, had trained with some of them and shared meals with others. And their loss was a wound that would take time to heal, but they had done what they came to do. And somewhere across the stars, the Velith people would live because of their sacrifice. Why do we mourn so few when so many enemies died? Yara asked later, when Myre had returned to the ship and the memorial services had been held. Myre looked at the Velith counselor with eyes that held sorrow and pride in equal measure. "Because every human life matters to us," she said softly. "And that is exactly why we fight so hard to protect them." She smiled through her tears as she thought of friends who would never go home. "We are Deathworlders. But we learned long ago that the only thing worth dying for is the chance to help others live." The journey to the front lines took 3 standard days, and Yanara spent every waking moment observing the humans with a mixture of terror and growing fascination. She had been assigned quarters near the officers' section of the ship and given free access to most areas, a gesture of trust that surprised her given how little these Deathworlders knew about her people. The first thing she noticed was how much the humans consumed. Watching them devour portions of food that could have fed a Velith family for days, they burned energy at rates that seemed impossible, their bodies running hot like engines that never fully cooled down even during rest. She witnessed a human stub their foot against a metal doorframe hard enough to draw blood, curse briefly in their strange language, and continue walking without seeking medical attention. When she asked about it later, the human had looked confused by her concern and explained that such minor injuries healed on their own within days. "Our bodies are constantly repairing themselves," Lieutenant Marie Yoon explained during one of their conversations in the ship's common area. Myra had been assigned as Yanara's liaison, a young officer with a warm smile that somehow made her predator features seem less threatening. We break bones and they grow back stronger. We get sick and our immune systems learn to fight the disease. We push ourselves past exhaustion and our muscles become more powerful. Yanara listened with growing amazement as Myra described a species that seemed designed for survival against impossible odds. "Does nothing kill your kind permanently?" she asked, only half joking as she tried to understand these impossible creatures. Myra's expression grew more serious as she considered the question carefully. "Many things can kill us," she admitted quietly. "But we learned long ago that the fear of death is more dangerous than death itself." She pulled out a small device and showed Yanara images of her home. A coastal city filled with towering buildings and millions of humans living in close proximity. "This is Bazan, where I was born and where my family still lives," she said with obvious affection in her voice. "My grandmother survived a war. My mother survived a pandemic. And I joined the Defense Coalition so that my younger siblings would not have to survive anything worse." Yanara stared at the images of this alien world that seemed both beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "Why do you fight?" she asked softly, genuinely wanting to understand the motivation behind this species that threw themselves into danger so willingly. "Why did your people answer our beacon when you could have ignored it and remained safe in your own territory?" Myra was quiet for a long moment before she answered. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of something deeply felt, because someone was scared and asked for help. She said simply, echoing the words her commander had used, "That is reason enough for any human worth the name." The simplicity of the answer struck Yanara like a physical blow, for she had expected complex political motivations or strategic calculations. These Deathworlders had crossed the galaxy to fight and die for strangers, simply because those strangers had been afraid. She thought about her own people, about how they had debated and hesitated, and nearly let themselves be destroyed rather than reach out for help. "Your species is very strange," she said finally, and Myra laughed in that odd barking way that humans use to express amusement. "You have no idea," the lieutenant replied with genuine warmth in her voice. The days passed quickly as Yanara learned more about her unlikely allies, and she found herself growing comfortable among these terrifying creatures. She watched them train in their combat exercises, moving with a coordination and aggression that should have been impossible for beings so large. They practiced hand-to-hand fighting that would have killed any Velith instantly, striking each other with blows that echoed through the training hall. But she also watched them care for each other afterward, tending to bruises and sharing food, and laughing about mistakes made during the exercises. They played games in their free time, competitions that involved throwing projectiles or solving puzzles under time pressure, always striving to improve themselves. "Why do you compete so constantly?" she asked Myra during one such game. "Watching humans race to complete some complex physical challenge, because standing still means dying on a world like Earth." Myra answered without hesitation. "Our ancestors who stopped improving were eaten by predators or killed by the environment. So the drive to become better is written into our very bones." The fleet dropped out of hyperspace on the edge of the Velith 4th colony system, and Yanara felt her heart freeze at what the sensors revealed the planet below was covered in Karath structures. Organic hives that spread across the surface like a disease, consuming healthy flesh. Millions of the creatures swarmed across what had once been peaceful cities and farming communities. And at the center of the largest hive, she could see the massive form of the Queen. The Velith escort ships that had accompanied the human fleet immediately began preparing to retreat. Their crew's overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the infestation. We should fall back and request reinforcements. The Velith fleet commander transmitted, his voice shaking with barely controlled fear. Negative, Commander Park replied calmly from the Indomitable's bridge, where Yanara stood watching with growing amazement. We have sufficient forces to accomplish our objective, and every day we delay means more of your people dying on other worlds. He turned to his tactical officer with an expression that Yanara was beginning to recognize as anticipation rather than concern. All ships, assume attack formation and prepare for orbital insertion, he ordered in a voice that carried absolute confidence. Ground teams, you will deploy in 30 minutes to secure a landing zone for the main assault force. Yanara watched the human crew move with practiced efficiency, checking weapons and equipment without any sign of the terror she would have expected. You are really going to attack that? She whispered, gesturing at the horrifying display of swarm forces covering the planet below. Commander Park looked at her with those predator eyes that somehow held reassurance. Counselor, my species once hunted animals 10 times our size with nothing but sharp sticks and stubborn determination. He smiled that terrible smile that she was beginning to find almost comforting. The swarm is about to learn why nothing on Earth ever tried to hunt humans twice. The assault began with fire raining from orbit, targeted strikes that blossomed across the swarm's defensive positions like flowers. Made of destruction, Yanara watched human dropships fall toward the planet's surface, carrying soldiers who sang battle songs as they descended into certain combat. She heard their communications, the jokes and encouragements and promises to watch each other's backs that passed between warriors who knew some of them would not return. Myray stood beside her in full combat armor, her weapon ready and her expression showing nothing but calm focus. Stay on the ship where it is safe, the lieutenant said gently, placing one hand on Yanara's shoulder with surprising tenderness. We will handle this, and when it is over, I will tell you stories about the battle that you can share with your people. Yanara watched her new friend walk toward the dropship bay with the rest of her unit, and she felt something she had never experienced before: pride in warriors who were not her own, hope and strength that she could not understand, and faith in Deathworlders who fought for strangers. The chamber fell silent as the holographic display flickered to life above the council table, and every member of the Velith High Council felt their hearts sink at what they saw. 3 worlds burned in the projection, their surfaces crawling with dark shapes that moved like living shadows across continents that had once held billions of peaceful souls. Counselor Yanara Suville gripped the edge of her seat with trembling fingers as she watched the footage from their border colonies, and she could not look away, even though every instinct told her to close her eyes. The Kara swarm had arrived without warning 6 weeks ago, and in that short time they had consumed everything in their path like a plague made of claws and hunger. We have lost contact with Colony 7 as of this morning, announced High Speaker Torvin, his voice heavy with exhaustion and grief that no amount of political training could hide. That makes 3 worlds in 40 rotations, whispered another counselor, and the words hung in the air like a death sentence that none of them could escape. Yanara looked around the table at her fellow leaders and saw the same terrible understanding in all their eyes. For the Velith were not a species built for war. They had evolved on gentle worlds with low gravity and mild seasons, where the greatest predators were small creatures that could be frightened away with loud noises. Their civilization had flourished for 10,000 years through cooperation and trade, through art and science and the patient building of connections. Between the stars, they had never needed weapons because they had never faced an enemy that could not be reasoned with or avoided through careful diplomacy. But the Kara swarm did not negotiate, and they did not stop, and they did not care about the lives they destroyed in their endless hunger for new hosts and new resources. Our fleet has engaged them at the threshold station, Torvin continued, pulling up tactical data that painted a grim picture of the battle still raging at their final defensive line. We have lost 60% of our ships in the first engagement alone, and the swarm continues to advance despite everything we throw at them. The numbers on the display told a story of desperate courage and inevitable defeat. Of Velith pilots flying into battle knowing they would not return. Yunara felt tears building behind her eyes as she thought of all those brave souls who had died trying to protect the people who had never learned how to protect themselves. "We must evacuate," said Counselor Marin, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic that spread through the chamber like ripples in still water. "We should scatter our people across the neutral systems and hope the swarm loses interest before they find us all." "The swarm does not lose interest," Yunara said quietly, and every head turned toward her as she spoke the truth that none of them wanted to hear. "They are not conquerors seeking territory or resources that can be negotiated over. And they are not raiders who will take what they want and leave." She stood from her seat and walked toward the display, her small frame seeming even smaller against the vast projection of burning worlds. "They are a hunger that consumes everything it touches, and they will follow us wherever we run until there is nothing left of our people, the memories." The silence that followed her words was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the environmental systems that kept the chamber comfortable for their fragile bodies. "Then, what do you suggest we do?" asked High Speaker Torvin. And Yunara could hear the desperate hope in his voice as he looked to her for an answer she was not sure she could give. "There is one option we have not considered," she said slowly, turning to face the council with a resolve that surprised even herself. "The ancient beacon in the Vault of Founders. The relic that our ancestors swore never to activate unless all other hope was lost." Gasps echoed through the chamber as counselors exchanged horrified glances at the mention of the artifact that had been forbidden for generations. "The beacon is a legend," protested Counselor Murren, though his voice lacked conviction as he spoke the words they had all been taught since childhood. "Our ancestors left clear warnings that activating it would summon forces beyond our understanding, beings from worlds we cannot imagine. Our ancestors also believed we would never face a threat we could not handle through wisdom and patience." Yunara replied firmly, "They were wrong. And now we must choose between clinging to old fears or reaching out to whatever powers might hear our cry for help." High Speaker Torvin rose slowly from his seat and walked to stand beside Yunara, his aged face showing the weight of the decision that now rested upon his shoulders. "The records say the beacon was created by the precursors themselves, left behind when they vanished from the galaxy millions of years before our species learned to walk." He turned to address the full council with the gravity of a leader who knew he was about to change everything. "It is designed to broadcast a distress call across distances we cannot measure to any civilization capable of receiving it. And what if those who answer are worse than the swarm?" demanded Counselor Marin, voicing the fear that lurked in all their hearts. "What if we summon monsters to save us from monsters, only to find ourselves trapped between two forms of destruction?" Yunara looked at the burning world still displayed above them, at the millions of her people who had already died and the billions more who would follow. "Then we will have traded a certain death for an uncertain one," she said quietly. "And I would rather take that chance than watch my people be devoured while we debate philosophy." The vote was unanimous. Though Yunara saw the terror in every hand that rose in agreement, within hours she stood in the Vault of Founders before a device that hummed with power older than her entire civilization, and she placed her hand upon its activation surface. The beacon fired a pulse of energy that crossed the galaxy in an instant, carrying a message that translated roughly into every language it encountered. "We are dying, and we cannot save ourselves, and we beg anyone who hears this to help us before it is too late." Far across the stars, on a small blue world that orbited an unremarkable yellow sun. The message arrived at a listening station built to detect exactly such signals. Commander Jinseo Park read the translation 3 times before he believed what he was seeing. And then he picked up his communicator to contact the United Earth Defense Coalition headquarters. "Sir, we have received what appears to be a genuine distress call from an unknown alien civilization," he reported calmly. Though his heart was racing with excitement and concern, they claim to be facing extinction from a hostile force and are requesting immediate military assistance at coordinates I am transmitting now. The debate at headquarters lasted exactly 4 hours before the decision was made, and Park volunteered his battle group for the mission without hesitation. 7 ships carrying 3,000 human soldiers jumped toward coordinates they had never seen, toward a species they had never met, because someone was afraid and had asked for help when the Velith sensors detected the incoming fleet. Yunara felt her hope turn to ice in her chest. The energy signatures were wrong, too hot and too aggressive, radiating power levels that should have been impossible for ships of their size. "What have we summoned?" whispered High Speaker Torvin as they watched the unknown vessels approach. Yunara could not answer, for she was beginning to suspect that they had called out to the universe for salvation, and the universe had sent them something far stranger than they could have imagined. The 7 vessels hung in space like predators waiting at the edge of firelight, and Yunara could not stop staring at the sensor readings that made no sense to her scientific mind. Every protocol and Velith first contact procedures screamed at her to run, to hide, to put as much distance as possible between her people and whatever had answered their desperate call. The ships were built wrong by every standard she knew. Too angular and aggressive in their design, covered in what appeared to be weapon systems rather than the communication arrays that civilized species displayed. "They are hailing us," announced the sensor operator, his voice trembling as he relayed the information that would change everything. High Speaker Torvin looked at Yunara with fear and desperate hope warring in his ancient eyes, and she understood that he was asking her to take a burden he could not carry himself. "I will respond," she said quietly, stepping forward to the communication station with legs that wanted to fold beneath her. The transmission that filled their screen showed a face that was both familiar and utterly alien. With 2 eyes and a mouth and features that seemed almost reasonable until you looked closer, the being had dense bone structure, visible beneath skin that seemed too thick, and muscles that moved with predatory grace even in the simple act of speaking. "This is Commander Jinseo Park of the United Earth Defense Coalition," the creature said in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder despite the translation. "Software, we receive your distress beacon and have come to offer assistance. But we require permission to enter your space and information about the threat you are facing." Yunara felt her hearts pounding as she processed the implications of what she was seeing and hearing. For this was first contact with a species that had never been documented in any Concord records. "I am Counselor Yunara Seville of the Velith High Council," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the terror that clawed at her thoughts. "We are grateful beyond words that you answered our call. But I must ask where your people come from and why you would travel so far to help strangers you have never met." The commander's expression shifted in a way that might have been a smile, though on his heavy features it looked more like a threat display. "We come from a world called Earth, in a system your charts likely do not contain. And we answered because someone was afraid and asked for help." He said it simply, as if such a reason needed no further explanation. And Yunara felt her understanding of the universe tilt sideways. "We will need to conduct a briefing before we can effectively assist you," the commander continued, in that calm and terrible voice. "I would like to invite representative from your government." to our flagship so we can discuss the tactical situation in detail. Every instinct Yunara possessed told her that boarding an alien vessel was madness. But she also knew that someone had to take this risk for her people. "I will come myself," she said before any of her fellow counselors could object or volunteer in her place. The shuttle ride to the human flagship was the longest journey of her life, despite lasting only minutes. And Yunara spent every second trying to prepare herself for what she might find. The hangar bay that swallowed her small craft was enormous and filled with vehicles that looked like instruments of war. And she understood that these humans were not a peaceful species like her own. Commander Park met her at the base of her shuttle ramp. And standing before him, Yunara realized just how large these creatures truly were. He towered over her like a mountain of muscle and bone. And yet his eyes held something that looked almost like gentleness as he extended one massive hand. "Welcome aboard the Indomitable, Counselor," he said as she tentatively placed her delicate fingers against his palm. "Please, follow me to the briefing room where we can talk without the distraction of formal protocols." The corridors of the ship were built for beings twice her height, and Yunara had to hurry to keep pace with the commander's long strides. She noticed that the humans they passed looked at her with curiosity rather than hostility, and several even nodded in greeting as she walked by. The briefing room was dominated by a large table covered in displays, and Park gestured for her to sit in a chair that had been hastily modified with cushions to accommodate her smaller frame. "Before we discuss the tactical situation, may I offer you refreshment?" he asked. And Yunara saw that a pitcher of clear liquid had been placed on the table. "What is that substance?" she asked cautiously, her scientific curiosity overcoming her fear for a moment. "Water," Park replied simply, pouring himself a glass and drinking deeply while Yunara watched in horrified fascination. "You drink that willingly," she whispered. For the compound analysis her suit was providing identified the liquid as something that would dissolve velith tissue on contact. "It makes up about 60% of our bodies," Park said with that threatening smile. And Yunara felt her understanding of these creatures shift into something approaching awe. "Your species must come from a truly remarkable world to have evolved such resistance to environmental hazards." Park's expression became thoughtful as he considered how to answer her implied question. "Earth is classified as a Category 12 world by the standards I believe you use," he said, carefully. Watching her reaction: high gravity, extreme temperature variations, toxic atmosphere by most species standards, and an ecosystem built on predation and competition. Yunara felt the blood drain from her face as she processed what he was telling her. For Category 12 worlds were considered uninhabitable by Concord science. "You are Deathworlders," she breathed, using the term that young Velith used to scare each other with stories of impossible monsters from hostile stars. "We prefer to think of ourselves as adaptable," Park replied with something that might have been humor in his voice. "Now, please tell me about this swarm that threatens your people. And do not spare any details, no matter how disturbing they might seem." Yunara spent the next hour describing the Kareth in all their horrible detail, from their method of reproduction through living hosts to their hive mind coordination that made them almost impossible to outmaneuver. She showed him footage of the attacks on her colonies, of Velith civilians being dragged away to become incubators for the next generation of monsters. She expected him to recoil in horror, or perhaps to decide that the threat was too great and abandon her people to their fate. Instead, she watched his expression change from attention to interest to something that looked almost like anticipation. "We have experience with parasitic organisms," he said when she finished, and his voice held an edge that made her scales tighten against her body. "Earth produced many species that use similar reproduction strategies, and humanity learned long ago how to deal with them. He stood and called up a tactical display that showed the current positions of Velith and swarm forces across the contested systems. Your fourth colony world appears to be their primary breeding ground based on the concentration of forces, he observed calmly. If we destroy that hive, we will significantly reduce their ability to replace losses and slow their advance. Yanara stared at him as if he had suggested they extinguish a star with their bare hands. You cannot be serious, she said weakly. That world is crawling with millions of Kareth warriors, and their queen controls them all from a central hive. Commander Park looked at her with those predator eyes that somehow held warmth beneath their intensity. Counselor, my people evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day of our existence. And we not only survived, but conquered it entirely. He leaned forward with a grin that showed teeth designed for tearing meat from bone. Show us where they are, and we will show you what Deathworlders can do when someone threatens the innocent.